In the unforgiving mountains of Afghanistan, where death lurks behind every boulder and the enemy knows every cave, 381 Navy SEALs found themselves trapped in what would become one of the most desperate rescue missions in military history. When all hope seemed lost and official orders demanded retreat, one helicopter pilot made a decision that would either save hundreds of lives or cost him everything he had worked for. This is the true story of courage that defied the impossible, loyalty that transcended orders, and a rescue that military experts said could never be done. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Hindu Kush Mountains as Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison adjusted his helmet and ran through his pre-flight checklist one final time. His MH-60 Black Hawk helicopter sat on the tarmac at Bagram Air Base, its rotors still and silent in the crisp Afghan air. Morrison had flown over 200 combat missions in his 12-year career, but something about this morning felt different. The tension in the briefing room had been thick enough to cut with a knife, and the worried expressions on his commanding officers' faces told him everything he needed to know about what lay ahead. Morrison was not just any pilot. Born and raised in small-town Montana, he had always dreamed of flying. As a child, he would lie on his back in the wheat fields behind his family's farm, watching military jets streak across the endless blue sky and imagining himself at the controls. His father, a Vietnam veteran who rarely spoke about his service, had initially tried to discourage his son from joining the military. But when Morrison graduated from the Naval Academy with honors and earned his wings, his father's pride was unmistakable. Now, at 34 years old, Morrison commanded respect from both his superiors and the men who flew with him. His crew chief, Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, had served with him for 3 years and trusted Morrison's judgment completely. Rodriguez often joked that Morrison could land a helicopter on a postage stamp in a hurricane, and the other pilots knew it wasn't much of an exaggeration. The mission briefing had been unlike any Morrison had attended before. Intelligence reports indicated that a large force of Navy SEALs, originally deployed for what should have been a routine reconnaissance mission, had become trapped in a valley deep in Taliban-controlled territory. The SEALs had been inserted 3 days earlier under cover of darkness, tasked with gathering intelligence on a suspected weapons cache and eliminating high-value targets. What they found instead was a carefully orchestrated trap. The Taliban had been feeding false intelligence to coalition forces for weeks, setting up an elaborate ambush that would draw elite American forces into a killing zone. The valley, surrounded by towering peaks and accessible only through a narrow gorge, had become a death trap from which there seemed to be no escape. Captain Sarah Chun, the mission intelligence officer, had painted a grim picture during the briefing. The SEALs were surrounded by an estimated 800 Taliban fighters who had taken up positions on the high ground surrounding the valley. Every attempt at radio contact had been met with either silence or desperate calls for immediate extraction. Drone footage showed the SEALs had managed to establish a defensive perimeter around an abandoned village at the valley center, but their ammunition was running low and casualties were mounting. What made the situation even more desperate was the weather. A massive storm system was moving in from the north, bringing with it winds that would make helicopter operations extremely dangerous, if not impossible. The window for any rescue attempt was closing rapidly, and once the storm hit, the SEALs would be on their own until it passed. Weather forecasters estimated the storm would last at least 5 days, far longer than the trapped men could hold out. Morrison's commanding officer, Colonel Frank Patterson, had been clear about the limitations they faced. The valley was too deep and narrow for fixed-wing aircraft to provide effective close-air support. The surrounding peaks were too high for artillery support from nearby bases. Any rescue mission would have to rely entirely on helicopters, flying through heavily defended airspace with no backup plan if things went wrong. As Morrison listened to the briefing, he studied the topographical maps spread across the conference table. The valley was indeed a nightmare for helicopter operations. The narrow entrance meant aircraft would have to fly single file through a corridor that was less than 200 meters wide in some places. The high altitude meant reduced engine performance and decreased lift capacity. Most concerning of all, the enemy positions on the surrounding ridgelines would provide perfect fields of fire for rocket-propelled grenades and heavy machine guns. The original rescue plan called for a coordinated assault involving 12 helicopters and 200 additional troops. The helicopters would provide covering fire while transport aircraft attempted to extract the trapped SEALs. It was a good plan on paper, but Morrison could see the fatal flaw immediately. The valley simply could not accommodate that many aircraft operating simultaneously. The rotor wash from multiple helicopters would create dangerous downdrafts, and the confined space would make it nearly impossible for pilots to maneuver effectively. When Morrison raised these concerns during the briefing, Colonel Patterson's response had been sobering. The military brass was already having second thoughts about the rescue mission. The risk of losing additional aircraft and personnel was deemed too high, especially given the uncertain number of survivors among the trapped SEALs. There was serious discussion about abandoning the rescue attempt altogether and waiting for the storm to pass, hoping that some of the SEALs might be able to escape on their own. Morrison felt his stomach tighten as he realized what that decision would mean. The SEALs trapped in the valley were not just fellow servicemen. They were friends, brothers in arms who had shared meals, training exercises, and countless dangerous missions. Many of them had families waiting at home, children who were counting on their fathers to return safely. The thought of abandoning them to their fate was unthinkable. As the briefing concluded, Morrison found himself thinking about a conversation he had had with his wife, Lisa, just a week earlier during their regular video call. She had been sitting in their kitchen back in Virginia, their 8-year-old daughter Emma visible in the background, working on homework at the dining room table. Lisa had asked him, as she always did, to promise her that he would not take any unnecessary risks. Morrison had given her the same answer he always gave, that he would be careful and that he would come home to them. Now, as he sat in his helicopter waiting for final orders, Morrison realized that his definition of unnecessary risk might be very different for what his commanders had in mind. The radio in his helmet crackled to life, and Colonel Patterson's voice came through clearly despite the static. "Morrison, this is Base Command. We've received updated intelligence on the situation in the valley. The number of trapped personnel has been confirmed at 381 SEALs from 3 different platoons. Casualty reports indicate approximately 40% wounded, with several in critical condition requiring immediate medical evacuation." Morrison absorbed this information while continuing his pre-flight checks. The number was staggering. 381 men represented nearly a quarter of all Navy SEALs deployed in Afghanistan. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were the elite of the elite, men who had undergone years of specialized training and countless dangerous missions. The loss of so many experienced operators would be a devastating blow to special operations capabilities in the region. "Command, this is Morrison. What's the current status of the rescue operation? Are we proceeding with the original plan?" There was a long pause before Colonel Patterson responded, and when he did, Morrison could hear the frustration in his voice. "Morrison, I'm going to be straight with you. Washington is getting cold feet about this operation. The Joint Chiefs are concerned about the potential for additional casualties, and there's talk of postponing the rescue attempt until after the storm passes." Morrison felt anger rising in his chest. "Sir, with respect, those men won't last 5 days in their current situation. The intelligence reports indicate they're already running low on ammunition and medical supplies. If we wait for the storm to pass, we'll be conducting a recovery operation, not a rescue. I understand your concerns, Morrison, but the decision is being made at levels far above my pay grade. The risk assessment indicates a high probability of losing additional aircraft and personnel in any immediate rescue attempt. The valley is simply too well defended, and the weather conditions are deteriorating rapidly." Morrison looked out at the horizon where dark clouds were beginning to gather. The meteorologist had been right about the approaching storm. In a few hours, flying would become extremely dangerous, if not impossible. This might be the last opportunity to reach the trapped SEALs before they were completely cut off. Command, what if we modified the approach? Instead of sending 12 aircraft through that narrow corridor, what if we sent just 1 or 2 helicopters? A smaller force might be able to slip through the enemy defenses and evacuate at least some of the wounded. Again, there was silence on the radio before Colonel Patterson responded. Morrison, that's essentially a suicide mission. A single helicopter would be completely vulnerable to enemy fire, and there's no way one aircraft could evacuate 381 men. Even if you managed to reach them, you'd only be adding to the casualty count. Morrison understood his commander's logic, but he also understood something that the planners back at headquarters might not fully grasp. The SEALs trapped in that valley were not going to give up without a fight. They would hold their position as long as humanly possible, hoping and believing that someone would come for them. That faith in their fellow servicemen was part of what made them so effective as a fighting force. But it also meant they would fight to the last man rather than attempt to break out on their own. As Morrison continued his preparations, his crew chief, Sergeant Rodriguez, climbed into the helicopter and began his own checks of the aircraft systems. Rodriguez was a veteran of 4 tours in Afghanistan and had an almost supernatural ability to keep helicopters flying under the most adverse conditions. Morrison had seen Rodriguez perform minor miracles with duct tape and spare parts, and there was no one he would rather have by his side on a dangerous mission. Skip, what's the word on this mission? Rodriguez asked as he tested the helicopter's communication systems. The rumors around the base are getting pretty wild. Morrison filled Rodriguez in on the basic situation while continuing to monitor his instruments. As he spoke, he could see the concern growing on his crew chief's face. Rodriguez had friends among the trapped SEALs, men he had served with on previous deployments. The thought of abandoning them was clearly weighing heavily on him. So what's the plan, sir? Are we going in or not? Before Morrison could answer, the radio crackled to life again. This time it was a different voice, one Morrison didn't recognize immediately. All aircraft, this is Viper 77 calling for immediate assistance. We are taking heavy casualties and require immediate medical evacuation. Our position is compromised, and we cannot hold much longer. The transmission was weak and filled with static, but the desperation in the voice was unmistakable. Morrison quickly checked his charts and realized that the call sign Viper 77 belonged to one of the SEAL teams trapped in the valley. Somehow, they had managed to get a radio transmission through despite the mountainous terrain and enemy jamming efforts. Morrison grabbed his microphone and keyed the transmit button. Viper 77, this is Angel Flight. We copy your transmission. Can you provide a status report on your current situation? The response came back immediately, though the signal was even weaker than before. Angel Flight, we have multiple wounded requiring immediate evacuation. Enemy forces are closing in on our position from all sides. We've taken casualties in every platoon, and our ammunition is nearly exhausted. We need extraction now, or we're not going to make it out of here. Morrison felt his heart pounding as he listened to the transmission. These men were fighting for their lives just a few miles away, and here he sat on the ground waiting for orders that might never come. He looked at Rodriguez, who was staring at him with an expression that clearly conveyed what they were both thinking. Command, this is Morrison. I just received a direct transmission from the trap personnel. They're reporting heavy casualties and requesting immediate evacuation. Permission to proceed with rescue operation. Colonel Patterson's response was swift and decisive. Negative, Morrison. You are not authorized to proceed. I repeat, you do not have authorization for rescue operations. All aircraft will remain on standby, pending further orders from higher command. Morrison stared at his radio for a long moment, processing what he had just heard. In 12 years of military service, he had never disobeyed a direct order. The consequences for doing so could include court-martial, imprisonment, and the end of his career. Everything he had worked for, everything he had sacrificed to achieve, could be destroyed in an instant if he chose to ignore his commander's orders. But As he sat there in his helicopter, Morrison could not stop thinking about the 381 men trapped in that valley. He thought about their families back home, waiting for news. He thought about the promises made to never leave a fallen comrade behind. Most of all, he thought about what he would want someone to do if he were the one trapped in an impossible situation with no hope of rescue. Rodriguez was watching him carefully, waiting to see what decision their pilot would make. In the distance, the radio continued to crackle with occasional transmissions from the trapped SEALs, each one more desperate than the last. The storm clouds were growing darker on the horizon, and Morrison knew that with each passing minute, the chances of a successful rescue were diminishing. Morrison closed his eyes for a moment and thought about his daughter Emma. He had promised Lisa that he would not take unnecessary risks, but was risking everything to save 381 fellow servicemen really unnecessary? Or was it the most necessary thing he had ever been asked to do? When Morrison opened his eyes, his decision was made. He looked at Rodriguez and saw his own determination reflected in his crew chief's face. Without saying a word, they both understood what was about to happen. Morrison reached for his radio one final time before takeoff. "Command, this is Morrison. I am declaring an emergency rescue operation under my authority as aircraft commander. I am proceeding to extract wounded personnel from the valley." Morrison out. Before Colonel Patterson could respond, Morrison switched off his radio and began the engine startup sequence. The Black Hawk's turbines whined to life, and the rotor blades began their steady beat against the morning air. In a few minutes, Morrison would be airborne and committed to a course of action that would either save hundreds of lives or end his military career forever. The Black Hawk lifted off from Bagram Air Base with a thunderous roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Morrison felt the familiar sensation of leaving solid ground behind as his aircraft climbed into the thin mountain air. Below him, the sprawling military base grew smaller with each passing second, and ahead lay the most dangerous flight of his career. Rodriguez had strapped himself into his position behind the crew-served machine, gun mounted in the helicopter's door. Despite the gravity of their situation, Morrison could see his crew chief methodically checking his weapon systems and ammunition supply. Rodriguez's calm professionalism in the face of overwhelming odds was exactly what Morrison needed to see. If they were going to have any chance of pulling off this impossible rescue, they would need to function as a perfect team. As the helicopter gained altitude and speed, Morrison began plotting the most direct route to the valley where the SEALs were trapped. The mountainous terrain of Afghanistan presented unique challenges for helicopter operations. The thin air at high altitude reduced engine performance and made the aircraft less responsive to control inputs. Additionally, the unpredictable wind patterns created by the towering peaks could cause sudden and dangerous downdrafts that could slam an aircraft into the ground without warning. Morrison had studied the topographical maps extensively during the mission briefing, but seeing the actual terrain through his cockpit windows brought home the full scope of the challenge ahead. The Hindu Kush Mountains stretched endlessly in all directions, their snow-capped peaks piercing the sky like ancient spears thrust up from the earth itself. The valleys between these giants were deep and narrow, creating perfect conditions for the kind of ambush that had trapped the SEAL teams. 20 minutes into the flight, Morrison's radio crackled to life, despite his having switched it off earlier. The signal was coming through on an emergency frequency that could not be disabled, and Colonel Patterson's voice was clearly audible despite his obvious anger. "Morrison, this is base command. You are ordered to return to base immediately. I repeat, return to base immediately. You are in direct violation of orders and are placing military personnel at unnecessary risk. If you do not comply immediately, you will face court-martial upon your return." Morrison reached for his radio controls, but hesitated before responding. He understood the position his commanding officer was in. Colonel Patterson was a good man who genuinely cared about his people, but he was also bound by orders from higher up the chain of command. The decision to abandon the rescue mission had likely come from the Pentagon, where analysts and strategists were looking at casualty projections and risk assessments rather than thinking about the individual lives at stake. Finally, Morrison keyed his microphone and responded. "Command, this is Morrison. I understand your position, and I accept full responsibility for my actions. Those men in the valley are counting on us, and I cannot abandon them. I will face whatever consequences await me when I return, but first I'm going to bring our people home." Before Colonel Patterson could respond, Morrison switched his radio to a different frequency and tried to establish contact with the trapped SEALs. The mountainous terrain made radio communication extremely difficult, but Morrison hoped that as he got closer to their position, he might be able to break through the interference and coordinate a rescue plan. The landscape below continued to change as Morrison flew deeper into Taliban-controlled territory. The few villages scattered throughout the valleys appeared to be abandoned, their mud brick buildings standing empty like tombstones in a forgotten cemetery. Morrison knew that appearances could be deceiving in Afghanistan. Those seemingly empty buildings could be hiding enemy fighters, and every ridge line could conceal spotters who would report his aircraft's movements to hostile forces. As Morrison navigated through a particularly narrow mountain pass, Rodriguez suddenly pointed to the ground below and shouted over the noise of the helicopter's engines. "Skip, movement down there at 2 o'clock. Morrison banked the helicopter slightly to get a better view of what Rodriguez had spotted. Below them, a group of approximately 20 armed men were moving quickly along a mountain trail. Even from their altitude, Morrison could see that the men were carrying weapons and equipment that clearly identified them as hostile forces. They appeared to be heading in the same direction as Morrison's aircraft, toward the valley where the SEALs were trapped. "Those are definitely bad guys," Rodriguez reported through the helicopter's intercom system. "They're armed with RPGs and what looks like heavy machine guns. Probably reinforcements heading to join the party at the valley." Morrison made a mental note of the enemy fighter's position, but continued toward his objective. Engaging the ground forces would only reveal his presence and alert every hostile unit in the area to his approach. The element of surprise was one of the few advantages he still possessed, and he could not afford to waste it on a target that was not directly threatening the trapped SEALs. 30 minutes into the flight, Morrison finally began to pick up radio transmissions from the valley. The signals were weak and intermittent, but he could clearly hear American voices calling for assistance. One transmission stood out clearly above the static. Any friendly aircraft, this is Viper 77. We have multiple urgent medical evacuations required. Our perimeter is shrinking, and we cannot hold this position much longer." Morrison immediately responded. "Viper 77, this is Angel Flight. I am inbound to your position for medical evacuation. Can you provide a status update on your current situation and the best approach route to your position?" The response came back quickly, filled with a mixture of relief and desperation. "Angel Flight, this is Lieutenant Commander Sarah Thompson, commanding Viper 77. We have 381 personnel in 3 defensive positions around an abandoned village. We have suffered approximately 150 casualties, with 40 requiring immediate medical evacuation. Enemy forces have us surrounded on all sides with estimated strength of 800 fighters. They have heavy weapons positioned on the ridge lines with clear fields of fire into the valley." Morrison absorbed this information while continuing to study the terrain ahead. The casualty numbers were worse than the initial reports had indicated. 150 casualties out of 381 personnel meant that nearly 40% of the trapped force was wounded. Even more concerning was the fact that 40 of those casualties required immediate medical evacuation. His helicopter could carry perhaps 12 stretcher cases at most, which meant multiple trips would be necessary to evacuate all the critically wounded. "Viper 77, what is your ammunition status? Can you provide covering fire for helicopter operations in the valley?" Lieutenant Commander Thompson's response confirmed Morrison's worst fears. "Angel Flight, we are critically low on ammunition for all weapon systems. We have enough for perhaps one more sustained engagement, but after that we'll be fighting with knives and bayonets. We can provide covering fire for your approach, but it will likely be the last organized resistance we can offer." Morrison felt his stomach tighten as the full scope of the situation became clear. The SEALs were not just trapped. They were on the verge of being completely overrun. Their ammunition was nearly exhausted, their casualties were mounting, and enemy forces were closing in from all sides. This was not going to be a routine medical evacuation. It was going to be a desperate race against time to extract as many wounded as possible before the entire position was overrun. As Morrison's helicopter approached the entrance to the valley, he could see the geographical features that made the area such a perfect killing zone. The valley was approximately 2 miles long and half a mile wide at its broadest point. High ridgelines surrounded it on all sides, providing perfect positions for enemy fighters to rain down fire on anything moving in the valley floor. The only entrance was a narrow gorge barely wide enough for a single helicopter to pass through safely. Morrison could see muzzle flashes from enemy positions on the ridgelines, indicating that the battle was still raging. Smoke was rising from several locations within the valley, suggesting that the SEALs' defensive positions had taken direct hits from enemy mortars or rocket-propelled grenades. Even from several miles away, Morrison could hear the distant sound of gunfire echoing off the mountain walls. "Rodriguez, can you see any movement in the valley?" Morrison asked his crew chief, who was scanning the area through high-powered binoculars. "Affirmative, sir. I can see what looks like 3 separate defensive positions around a cluster of buildings in the center of the valley. There's definitely fighting going on down there, and it looks like our guys are taking fire from multiple directions. I'm also seeing enemy positions all along the ridge lines with what appears to be heavy weapons." Morrison began his approach to the valley entrance, carefully studying the terrain for the best route to reach the trapped SEALs. The narrow gorge that served as the entrance was approximately 200 meters wide and flanked by vertical cliff faces that rose nearly 500 feet on either side. Flying through that corridor would be like threading a needle while under fire from enemy positions above. As Morrison began his descent toward the gorge entrance, his radio exploded with urgent transmissions from Valley. "Angel Flight, this is Viper 77. Enemy forces are massing for a final assault on our position. We need immediate extraction for our wounded, or we're going to lose them all." Morrison could hear the sounds of intense gunfire in the background of the transmission, and he realized that he was running out of time even faster than he had anticipated. The SEALs were making their last stand, and if he did not reach them soon, there might not be anyone left to rescue. "Viper 77, this is Angel Flight. I am beginning my approach to the valley now. Prepare your most critical casualties for immediate evacuation. I'll take as many as I can carry on this first trip." As Morrison guided his helicopter into the narrow gorge, he felt as if he was flying into the mouth of a giant stone monster. The cliff walls on either side seemed to close in around his aircraft, and the rotor wash from his helicopter created dangerous downdrafts as it interacted with the confined space. Morrison had to make constant adjustments to his flight controls to maintain level flight in the turbulent air. Halfway through the gorge, Morrison spotted the first enemy position. A group of Taliban fighters had established a firing position on a ledge about halfway up the cliff face, and they were armed with rocket-propelled grenades and heavy machine guns. As soon as they spotted Morrison's helicopter, they opened fire. The first RPG round screamed past Morrison's aircraft, missing his main rotor by less than 10 feet. The explosion against the cliff wall behind him sent a shower of rock fragments clattering against his helicopter's fuselage. Morrison immediately began evasive maneuvers, weaving his aircraft back and forth within the confines of the narrow gorge while trying to maintain forward progress toward the valley. Rodriguez opened fire with his door-mounted machine gun, sending streams of tracer rounds toward the enemy position. His accurate fire forced the Taliban fighters to take cover, buying Morrison precious seconds to clear the immediate threat area. But even as they dealt with the first enemy position, Morrison could see muzzle flashes from additional positions further along the gorge walls. "Skip, we've got multiple firing positions ahead," Rodriguez shouted over the noise of his machine gun. "I count at least 6 different locations with heavy weapons. They've got this approach route completely covered." Morrison continued his high-speed dash through the gorge, relying on speed and evasive maneuvers to avoid the increasingly heavy enemy fire. Bullets sparked off his helicopter's armor plating, and more RPG rounds exploded against the cliff walls around him. The confined space of the gorge made it impossible to avoid all the incoming fire, and Morrison knew it was only a matter of time before his aircraft took a serious hit. Just as Morrison thought they might not make it through the gorge alive, the walls suddenly opened up, and he found himself flying over the valley where the SEALs were trapped. The scene that greeted him was one of devastating destruction. The abandoned village that the SEALs had chosen for their defensive position was partially destroyed, with several buildings reduced to piles of rubble. Smoke was rising from multiple locations, and Morrison could see the muzzle flashes of ongoing firefights throughout the area. "Viper 7-7, this is Angel Flight. I am now in the valley and looking for a landing zone. Where do you want me to set down?" Lieutenant Commander Thompson's response came back immediately. "Angel Flight, we have cleared a landing zone in the center of the village, marked with yellow smoke. Be advised, enemy fire is coming from the ridge lines on all sides. We'll provide what covering fire we can, but you'll be exposed during your approach and landing." Morrison could see the yellow smoke rising from the village center and began his approach to the improvised landing zone. As his helicopter descended toward the ground, enemy fire from the surrounding ridge lines intensified dramatically. Morrison could hear bullets striking his aircraft's fuselage and see tracers streaking past his cockpit windows. One round shattered his left side window, showering him with glass fragments and allowing the cold mountain air to rush into the cabin. Rodriguez was firing continuously now, trying to suppress as many enemy positions as possible. But there were simply too many hostile fighters, and they had perfect fields of fire into the valley. Morrison realized that landing in the valley was going to be extremely dangerous, not just for his crew, but for the SEALs who would have to expose themselves to carry wounded personnel to his helicopter. Despite the overwhelming enemy fire, Morrison managed to bring his helicopter down in the cleared area marked by yellow smoke. As soon as his wheels touched the ground, SEALs began rushing toward the aircraft, carrying wounded comrades on improvised stretchers. Morrison could see the exhaustion and desperation on their faces, but also the determination that had kept them fighting against impossible odds. Lieutenant Commander Thompson was one of the first people to reach Morrison's helicopter. She was a tall, athletic woman in her early 30s with short blonde hair and piercing blue eyes that reflected both intelligence and determination. Despite having been in continuous combat for 3 days, she moved with the confidence and precision that marked her as an exceptional military leader. "Commander Morrison," she shouted over the noise of the helicopter's engines. "Thank God you came. We didn't think anyone was coming for us." Morrison could see the relief in her eyes, but also the weight of command that she had been carrying. As the senior officer on the ground, Lieutenant Commander Thompson had been responsible for keeping 381 people alive in an impossible situation. The casualties they had suffered weighed heavily on her, and Morrison could see the toll that the battle had taken on her physically and emotionally. "How many critical casualties do you have ready for immediate evacuation?" Morrison asked as his crew chief began helping to load wounded SEALs into the helicopter. 12 critical cases that won't survive without immediate surgical intervention, Thompson replied. "But we have another 30 that really need medical attention as soon as possible." "How many can you take?" Morrison looked at the wounded SEALs being loaded into his aircraft and made a quick calculation. His helicopter was already at maximum weight capacity with 12 stretcher cases, but he could probably squeeze in a few more if some of the wounded could sit upright. The problem was that each additional passenger increased the risk that his overloaded aircraft would not be able to clear the mountain peaks surrounding the valley. "I could take 14 this trip, but That's absolute maximum. I'll come back for more as soon as I can get these guys to medical care. As the loading continued, Morrison could see that the SEAL situation was even more desperate than the radio transmissions had indicated. Many of the men were wounded, exhausted, and running critically low on ammunition. The defensive perimeter around the village had shrunk considerably, and enemy forces were clearly preparing for a final assault that would overrun the remaining defenders. One of the wounded SEALs being loaded into Morrison's helicopter was a young man who could not have been more than 22 years old. He had taken shrapnel wounds to his chest and legs, and Morrison could see that he was fading fast. As the medics worked to stabilize him for the flight out of the valley, the young SEAL grabbed Morrison's arm with surprising strength. "Sir," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the helicopter noise. "Don't leave them behind. Please don't leave my brothers behind." Morrison looked into the young man's eyes and saw a plea that went far beyond personal fear. This wounded warrior was not worried about his own survival. He was terrified that his fellow SEALs would be abandoned to die in this godforsaken valley. Morrison placed his hand on the young man's shoulder and made a promise that he was not sure he could keep. "Son, I give you my word. I'm going to keep coming back until I get every single one of your brothers out of here. That's a promise." As the last of the wounded were loaded into his helicopter, Morrison began the engine startup sequence for takeoff. The aircraft was heavily overloaded, and he could feel the strain on the engines as they struggled to generate enough power for vertical lift in the thin mountain air. Enemy fire was still coming from the ridge lines, but it had decreased somewhat as the SEALs provided covering fire for Morrison's departure. Lieutenant Commander Thompson appeared at Morrison's cockpit window one final time before takeoff. "Commander, I need to know honestly, are you really coming back? Because if you're not, we need to know so we can prepare for the final assault." Morrison looked directly into her eyes and spoke with absolute conviction. "I'm coming back, and I'm going to keep coming back until every single one of you is out of this valley. You have my word on that." As Morrison's overloaded helicopter struggled to gain altitude and clear the valley walls, he was already planning his next trip. He had managed to evacuate 14 critically wounded SEALs, but that still left 367 personnel trapped in an increasingly desperate situation. The enemy was closing in, ammunition was running out, and the approaching storm would soon make helicopter operations impossible. Morrison knew that what he had just accomplished was only the beginning. The most dangerous part of this rescue mission still lay ahead, and the odds against success were growing longer with each passing minute. But he had made a promise to those SEALs, and he intended to keep it no matter what the cost. The flight back to Bagram Air Base was a nightmare of mechanical stress and medical emergency. Morrison's overloaded helicopter struggled to maintain altitude as they climbed out of the valley, the engines straining against the thin mountain air and the excessive weight of 14 wounded passengers. Every few seconds, one of the wounded SEALs would cry out in pain as the aircraft bounced through turbulence, and the medical personnel aboard worked frantically to keep the most critical patients alive. Rodriguez had positioned himself in the cargo area to assist with medical care, applying pressure bandages and administering pain medication to those who needed it most. The young SEAL who had grabbed Morrison's arm during loading was unconscious now, his breathing shallow and labored. Rodriguez checked his pulse repeatedly, worry evident on his weathered face as he monitored the critically wounded warrior. As they cleared the mountain peaks and began their descent toward Bagram, Morrison's radio crackled with an urgent transmission from the base medical facility. "Angel Flight, this is Bagram Medical. We have surgical teams standing by and are prepared to receive 14 casualties. What is the nature of their injuries?" Morrison keyed his microphone while continuing to monitor his struggling engines. "Bagram Medical, I have multiple penetrating trauma wounds, severe blood loss, and possible internal injuries. At least 4 patients are critical and require immediate surgical intervention. ETA to your location is 8 minutes." The landing at Bagram was controlled chaos as medical teams rushed to meet Morrison's helicopter. Within seconds of touchdown, stretchers were being loaded with wounded SEALs and rushed toward the hospital facility. Morrison watched as the young man who had begged him not to abandon his brothers was carried away on a stretcher, still unconscious but alive. As soon as the last wounded SEAL was offloaded, Morrison began preparations for his return trip to the valley. Rodriguez was already refueling the helicopter and conducting rapid maintenance checks to ensure the aircraft was ready for another combat mission. Morrison used the brief respite to study updated intelligence reports and weather forecasts. The news was not encouraging. Drone surveillance indicated that enemy forces in the valley had been reinforced and were preparing for a final assault on the SEAL positions. The weather was deteriorating rapidly, with wind speeds increasing and visibility decreasing as the storm system moved closer to the region. Most concerning of all, intelligence reports suggested that Taliban commanders were aware of Morrison's rescue attempts and were positioning additional forces to intercept any further helicopter operations. Colonel Patterson approached Morrison's aircraft as he completed his pre-flight preparations. The colonel's expression was grim, and Morrison could see the internal conflict playing out across his commander's face. Patterson was clearly torn between his orders from higher command and his desire to support the rescue of trapped American personnel. "Morrison, I'm going to ask you one more time to reconsider this mission," Patterson said as he stopped beside the helicopter. "Intelligence indicates that the Taliban have moved at least 2 companies of fighters into position specifically to target rescue helicopters. They know you're coming back, and they're ready for you." Morrison paused in his preparations and looked directly at his commanding officer. "Sir, I understand the risks, but I made a promise to those men, and I intend to keep it. There's still 367 SEALs trapped in that valley, and they're counting on us to get them out." Patterson nodded slowly, and Morrison could see a mixture of pride and concern in the older officer's eyes. "Morrison, you're one of the finest pilots I've ever served with, but this mission is beyond dangerous. It's borderline suicidal. If you go back in there, there's a very real possibility that you won't come back out. Sir, with respect, if I don't go back in there, those SEALs definitely won't come back out. They've been holding that position for 3 days against overwhelming odds. The least I could do is give them a fighting chance." Patterson studied Morrison for a long moment before speaking again. "Against my better judgment and direct orders from higher command, I'm not going to stop you. But I want you to know that if you're shot down in that valley, I don't have authorization to send additional aircraft to rescue you. You'll be on your own." Morrison understood the implications of what his commander was telling him. If his helicopter was damaged or destroyed during the rescue operation, he and Rodriguez would likely share the same fate as the SEALs they were trying to save. There would be no cavalry coming to rescue the rescuers. "I understand, sir, Rodriguez, and I accept those risks." As Morrison's helicopter lifted off from Bagram for his second trip to the valley, he could see other aircraft being prepared for departure. Word of the rescue operation had spread throughout the base, and several pilots had volunteered to join Morrison despite the official prohibition on the mission. Morrison was touched by their willingness to risk everything for fellow servicemen, but he also knew that multiple aircraft would only increase the likelihood of casualties. The flight back to the valley took on a different character for Morrison's first trip. This time, he was flying with the knowledge that enemy forces were specifically targeting helicopter operations. The Taliban fighters would be more alert, better positioned, and prepared for his arrival. Additionally, the approaching storm was beginning to affect flying conditions, with increasing turbulence and decreasing visibility. As Morrison approached the valley entrance, he could immediately see that the tactical situation had changed dramatically. The narrow gorge that provided access to the valley was now swarming with enemy fighters. Morrison counted at least a dozen new fighting positions that had been established since his first trip, each one armed with heavy weapons specifically designed to destroy aircraft. "Rodriguez, this is going to be significantly more challenging than our first run," Morrison said through the helicopter's intercom system. "They know we're coming, and they're ready for us. Rodriguez checked his machine gun one final time and adjusted his protective gear. Roger that, sir. I'm ready when you are. Morrison began his approach to the gorge, but this time he modified his tactics based on the increased enemy presence. Instead of flying straight through the canyon at high speed, he chose to fly an erratic pattern that would make it more difficult for enemy fighters to target his aircraft. The downside of this approach was that it would take longer to reach the trapped SEALs, time that they might not have. The enemy fire was immediate and intense. As soon as Morrison's helicopter entered the gorge, rocket-propelled grenades began exploding around his aircraft. The Taliban fighters had clearly learned from his first passage and had adjusted their tactics accordingly. Instead of firing individual RPG rounds, they were now firing multiple rounds simultaneously to create an inescapable barrage. Morrison threw his helicopter into a series of violent evasive maneuvers, diving and climbing and banking sharply to avoid the incoming fire. His aircraft was struck multiple times by small arms fire, and he could hear the distinctive sound of bullets penetrating the fuselage. One round shattered his remaining cockpit window, and another damaged one of his engine oil pressure indicators. Rodriguez was firing continuously, but there were simply too many enemy positions to suppress them all effectively. For every Taliban fighter he forced to take cover, two more seemed to appear from previously hidden positions. Morrison realized that the enemy had spent the time between his trips preparing a killing zone specifically designed to destroy helicopters attempting to transit the gorge. Halfway through the canyon, Morrison's helicopter took a direct hit from an RPG round that exploded against his tailbone. The blast damaged his tail rotor and caused the aircraft to begin spinning uncontrollably. Morrison fought to regain control of his helicopter while continuing to take fire from multiple directions. Engine temperature is climbing rapidly. Rodriguez shouted over the noise of combat. Oil pressure is dropping on engine number 2. Morrison could feel his helicopter becoming less responsive to control inputs, and he knew that his aircraft had been seriously damaged. Under normal circumstances, he would have immediately turned back and attempted an emergency landing at the nearest safe location. But there were 367 SEALs trapped in the valley ahead, and this might be their last chance for rescue before the storm made helicopter operations impossible. Making a split-second decision that would define the rest of the mission, Morrison continued his approach to the valley despite his aircraft's damage. He compensated for the damaged tail rotor by adjusting his flight attitude and using his remaining engine power to maintain forward progress. The helicopter was becoming increasingly difficult to control, but Morrison managed to keep it flying through sheer determination and superior piloting skills. When Morrison finally cleared the gorge and entered the valley, the scene that greeted him was even worse than before. The SEAL defensive positions had been overrun in several locations, and enemy forces were now fighting within the village itself. Morrison could see muzzle flashes from building to building combat, indicating that the SEALs were engaged in close quarters fighting with Taliban forces. Viper 77, this is Angel Flight returning for additional evacuation. Morrison transmitted on the emergency frequency. What is your current status? Lieutenant Commander Thompson's response was immediate but strained. Angel Flight, our perimeter has been breached in 2 locations. Enemy forces are inside the village, and we're fighting house to house. We have additional wounded requiring evacuation, but the landing zone is now under direct fire. Morrison could see that the yellow smoke marking the landing zone was no longer visible, likely because the SEALs had been forced to abandon that position. Enemy muzzle flashes were coming from buildings that had been in American hands during his first visit, indicating just how rapidly the tactical situation was deteriorating. Viper 77, I'm going to attempt to land in the northwest corner of the village. Can you get your wounded to that location? Angel Flight, that area is partially overrun, but we'll try to fight our way through. Be advised, my ammunition situation is critical. We have perhaps 5 minutes of organized resistance left before we're completely overrun. Morrison surveyed the northwest corner of the village and identified a small courtyard that might serve as an improvised landing zone. The area was under fire from enemy positions, but it appeared to be the best option available given the circumstances. Morrison began his approach to the courtyard, knowing that landing his damaged helicopter in a combat zone under enemy fire was an extremely risky proposition. As Morrison descended toward the courtyard, his damaged tail rotor finally gave up completely. The helicopter began spinning violently, and Morrison had to use all of his skill and experience to prevent a complete loss of control. He managed to auto-rotate the aircraft down to a hard landing in the courtyard, but the impact damaged his landing gear and caused several instrument panels to fail. "Rodriguez, are you okay?" Morrison called to his crew chief as smoke began filling the helicopter's cabin. "I'm good, sir, but we're definitely not flying out of here in this bird," Rodriguez replied as he examined the damage to their aircraft systems. "The engines are still running, but everything else is pretty much shot." Before Morrison could fully assess the damage to his helicopter, SEALs began appearing from various buildings around the courtyard, carrying wounded comrades toward his aircraft. Morrison could see that these men were at the absolute limit of their endurance. They were dirty, bloodied, and exhausted, but they continued to fight with the determination that had made them legends in the special operations community. Lieutenant Commander Thompson was among the first to reach Morrison's helicopter, and he could see that she had been wounded since his last visit. Blood was seeping through a bandage on her left arm, and she moved with the careful deliberation of someone who was fighting through significant pain. "Commander Morrison, I can't believe you came back," she said as she helped load wounded SEALs into his damaged helicopter. "When we saw your bird take hits in the canyon, we thought you'd been shot down." "I made a promise," Morrison replied simply. "How many wounded do you have ready for evacuation?" 16 critical cases, but my aircraft is badly damaged, and I'm not sure it will make it out of the valley." Thompson paused in her loading activities and looked directly at Morrison. "Commander, I need to be honest with you. We're about to be completely overrun. Enemy forces have broken through our perimeter in multiple locations, and we're down to our last magazines of ammunition. This might be the last helicopter that makes it out of this valley alive." Morrison understood the implications of what she was telling him. If he loaded his helicopter with wounded SEALs and attempted to take off, he might be able to save 16 lives. But that would also mean abandoning the remaining 351 SEALs to certain death or capture. The weight of that decision pressed down on him like a physical force. As Morrison wrestled with this impossible choice, Rodriguez called out from the back of the helicopter. "Sir, I managed to get the engine stabilized, and I think we might be able to get airborne. It won't be pretty, and I can't guarantee we'll make it all the way back to base, but we might have one more flight left in this bird." Morrison looked at the wounded SEALs being loaded into his helicopter and then at Lieutenant Commander Thompson. In her eyes, he could see the same impossible choice that he was facing. As the senior officer on the ground, she had to decide which of her people had the best chance of survival and prioritize them for evacuation. "Commander Thompson, I want you to listen carefully," Morrison said as the loading continued around them. "I'm going to take these wounded back to base, but I'm not leaving you here. I'll find another aircraft and come back for the rest of your people." Thompson shook her head sadly. "Commander, with respect, there won't be time. The storm is already moving in, and enemy forces will have this entire valley under their control within the next hour. If you come back, you'll just be adding to the casualty count." Morrison could hear the resignation in her voice, but he could also hear the determination to fight to the end. Thompson and her remaining SEALs were prepared to make their last stand in this forgotten valley, but Morrison was not prepared to let that happen. "Commander, I've already violated direct orders to come this far. I'm not going to stop now. Get your people ready for one more fight, because I'm coming back with everything I can find." As Morrison prepared his damaged helicopter for takeoff, he could see enemy forces moving through the village in increasing numbers. The SEALs were fighting a running battle from building to building, but they were clearly being pushed back toward the center of the village. Morrison knew that time was running out, not just for this evacuation, but for any chance of rescuing the remaining personnel. The takeoff from the courtyard was the most challenging flight maneuver Morrison had ever attempted. His damaged helicopter barely had enough power to achieve lift, and the missing tail rotor made controlling the aircraft's direction nearly impossible. Morrison had to use a combination of engine power adjustments and cyclic control inputs to keep his aircraft pointed in the right direction as it climbed slowly out of the valley. Enemy fire followed them all the way to the valley rim, and Morrison's helicopter took several more hits during the climb out. One round destroyed his remaining oil pressure indicator, and another damaged his radio antenna. By the time Morrison cleared the mountain peaks and began his descent toward Bagram, his helicopter was barely flying, and his radio communications were completely inoperative. The emergency landing at Bagram was accomplished with no margin for error. Morrison's helicopter had lost so much power that he was forced to make a running landing on the main runway, using forward speed to supplement his diminished lift capacity. Emergency crews were standing by as his aircraft rolled to a stop, and medical teams immediately began evacuating the wounded SEALs. As Morrison climbed out of his damaged helicopter, he was already looking around the flight line for another aircraft he could use to return to the valley. Time was running out for the remaining SEALs, and Morrison knew that this next trip would likely be his last chance to save them. The storm was closing in, the enemy forces were overwhelming the remaining defenders, and Morrison's own aircraft was destroyed beyond repair. But Morrison had made a promise, and he intended to keep it no matter what obstacles stood in his way. The scene at Bagram Air Base was unlike anything Morrison had witnessed in his 12 years of military service. Word of his unauthorized rescue mission had spread throughout the base, and pilots, crew chiefs, and support personnel were gathering around a destroyed helicopter with expressions of amazement and concern. Morrison's aircraft looked like it had been through a war zone, which, he reflected grimly, it had. Colonel Patterson appeared at Morrison's side as the last of the wounded SEALs was loaded onto stretchers and rushed toward the medical facility. The colonel's expression was unreadable, but Morrison could see a mixture of pride, anger, and worry in his commanding officer's eyes. "Morrison, I've been monitoring radio intercepts from the valley," Patterson said quietly. "The situation is deteriorating rapidly. Intelligence estimates that the remaining SEAL forces will be completely overrun within the next 2 hours. The storm front is also moving faster than originally predicted, and will reach the area within 90 minutes. Morrison absorbed this information while surveying the aircraft available on the flight line. Most of the helicopters were either undergoing maintenance or configured for missions other than personnel evacuation. The few aircraft that were mission-ready belonged to other units and would require authorization from their commanding officers before they could be used for rescue operations. "Sir, I need another helicopter," Morrison stated simply. "There's still 351 SEALs trapped in that valley, and I'm the only one who knows the exact location and tactical situation. Those men are counting on me to come back for them." Colonel Patterson shook his head slowly. "Morrison, I've received direct orders from Central Command to cease all rescue operations immediately. The Pentagon has determined that additional rescue attempts would result in unacceptable casualties with minimal chance of success. You're officially grounded, and any pilot who attempts to support your mission will face court-martial." Morrison felt anger rising in his chest as he realized the full implications of what his commander was telling him. The military hierarchy had written off the remaining SEALs as acceptable losses, casualties of war who would have to be sacrificed to prevent additional risk to personnel and equipment. The cold calculation behind that decision made Morrison sick to his stomach. "Sir, those men fought for 3 days against impossible odds because they believed we would come for them. They held their position and suffered massive casualties because they trusted that we would never abandon them. How can we just write them off now?" Before Colonel Patterson could respond, a commotion erupted near the flight line as several pilots from other units approached Morrison's position. Leading the group was Captain Maria Santos, a veteran pilot from the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment who had a reputation for flying in impossible conditions. "Commander Morrison?" Santos called out as she approached. "I heard about what you've been doing in the valley. My crew, and I want to volunteer for the next rescue mission." Behind Santos, Morrison could see at least 6 other pilots and their crew members, all wearing expressions of determination that matched his own. These were experienced combat aviators who understood the risks involved, but who were also unwilling to abandon fellow servicemen in their hour of greatest need. Colonel Patterson stepped forward before Morrison could respond. "Captain Santos, I appreciate your willingness to volunteer, but I have direct orders prohibiting any further rescue operations. Any pilot who attempts to support Morrison's mission will face immediate court-martial and possible imprisonment." Santos looked directly at Colonel Patterson and spoke with quiet conviction. "Sir, with respect, some things are more important than careers and regulations. Those SEALs in the valley are our brothers, and we don't leave our brothers behind. If Commander Morrison is going back, then we're going with him." Morrison was moved by the show of support from his fellow pilots, but he also understood that their involvement would only result in additional courts-martial and destroyed careers. The rescue mission was already his responsibility, and he could not ask others to sacrifice their futures for a cause that had been officially abandoned. "Captain Santos, I appreciate your offer, but this is my mission and my responsibility," Morrison said firmly. "I won't ask any of you to risk your careers for something that headquarters has already written off as a lost cause." Santos smiled grimly and gestured toward the other pilots behind her. "Commander, you're not asking us to do anything. We're volunteering. And besides, if we don't come back from this mission, court-martial proceedings will be the least of our worries." Before anyone could respond, Rodriguez appeared at Morrison's elbow, carrying a detailed maintenance report on their damaged helicopter. The crew chief's expression was serious as he approached his pilot with the assessment. "Sir, I've completed my inspection of our bird," Rodriguez reported. "The good news is that the engines are still functional and most of the flight control systems are operational. The bad news is that we have no tail rotor, multiple fuel leaks, and damaged landing gear. This aircraft is not safe for flight operations under any circumstances." Morrison studied the maintenance report while considering his options. Without a functional helicopter, he had no way of returning to the valley to rescue the remaining SEALs. The other pilots had volunteered their aircraft, but Morrison was reluctant to involve them in an operation that could destroy their careers and possibly their lives. As Morrison wrestled with this dilemma, one of the base communications specialists approached with an urgent radio message. "Commander Morrison, I've been monitoring emergency frequencies, and I'm picking up transmissions from the valley. The SEALs are calling for immediate assistance." Morrison immediately followed the communications specialist to the radio equipment and took the headset. The signal from the valley was weak and filled with static, but he could clearly hear Lieutenant Commander Thompson's voice through the interference. Any friendly aircraft? This is Viper 77 with an urgent request for assistance. Our position is being overrun, and we have multiple wounded requiring immediate evacuation. We are down to our last ammunition and cannot hold much longer." Morrison keyed the microphone and responded immediately. "Viper 77, this is Angel Flight. I copy your transmission and am preparing to return to your location. What is your current status?" Thompson's response came back quickly, but Morrison could hear the strain and exhaustion in her voice. "Angel Flight, thank God you're still out there. We've been forced back to a single building in the center of the village. We have 47 wounded personnel, including 12 who are critical. Enemy forces have us completely surrounded and are preparing for a final assault." Morrison absorbed this information while studying the tactical map spread across the communications table. The situation in the valley had deteriorated even further since his last departure. The SEALs had been forced to abandon their defensive perimeter and were now trapped in a single building with nowhere to retreat. Viper 77. How much ammunition do you have remaining? Angel Flight, we're down to approximately 30 rounds per man for small arms, and we've expended all of our heavy weapons ammunition. We can probably hold for another 30 minutes, but after that we'll be fighting with knives and bare hands. Morrison felt the weight of responsibility crushing down on him as he realized that 351 elite warriors were facing annihilation while he stood helplessly on a safe airbase 50 miles away. These men had fought with incredible courage against overwhelming odds, believing that their fellow servicemen would not abandon them. Now they were facing their final moments while Morrison searched desperately for a way to reach them. Captain Santos appeared at Morrison's shoulder as he finished his radio conversation with the trapped SEALs. "Commander, we've been discussing the situation, and we have a proposal. My aircraft is configured for heavy lift operations and can carry more personnel than a standard Black Hawk. If we can reach the valley, we might be able to evacuate a significant number of the remaining SEALs in a single trip." Morrison looked at Santos and saw the same determination in her eyes that he felt in his own heart. These pilots understood the risks involved, but they also understood that abandoning 351 fellow servicemen was not an acceptable option. The military might be willing to write off these casualties as acceptable losses, but the aviators who would have to live with that decision were not. "Captain, if we attempt this mission, we're all going to face court-martial when we return," Morrison warned. "Our careers will be over, and we could face imprisonment. Are you and your people really willing to accept those consequences?" Santos looked back at the group of pilots and crew members who had volunteered for the mission, then turned back to Morrison with a slight smile. "Commander, some things are more important than careers. Those SEALs would do the same for us without hesitation. Besides, we didn't join the military to abandon our brothers when they needed us most." Morrison felt a surge of pride and gratitude as he looked at the group of volunteers who were willing to risk everything for fellow servicemen they had never met. These were the kind of people who made the military more than just another job, who understood that service sometimes required sacrifices that went far beyond normal duty requirements. Colonel Patterson, who had been listening to the entire conversation, finally stepped forward with resignation evident on his face. "Morrison, I cannot officially authorize this mission, and I cannot protect any of you from the consequences if you proceed. However, I also cannot in good conscience prevent you from attempting to save American lives." Patterson paused for a moment before continuing. "If you're going to do this, you need to understand that this will be a one-way mission. The storm front will make return flights impossible, and enemy forces will be expecting you. If you get shot down in that valley, there will be no rescue mission coming for the rescuers." Morrison understood the implications of what his commander was telling him. This final rescue attempt would either succeed completely or result in additional casualties that would make the entire situation even worse. There would be no second chances and no backup plan if things went wrong. "Sir, I understand the risks," Morrison replied, "but I made a promise to those SEALs, and I intend to keep it." Morrison turned to address the group of volunteer pilots and crew members who were preparing for the mission. "I want everyone to understand exactly what we're attempting here. We're going to fly into a heavily defended valley where 800 enemy fighters are waiting for us. We're going to land in the middle of an active firefight and attempt to evacuate 351 personnel while under continuous enemy fire. The aircraft we'll be flying has never been tested under these conditions, and there's a significant probability that we won't survive the mission." Morrison paused to let his words sink in before continuing. "Anyone who wants to back out can do so now with no judgment from me or anyone else. This is entirely voluntary, and no one will think less of you if you decide the risks are too great." Not a single pilot or crew member moved. They stood silently, waiting for Morrison to continue with the mission planning. Their expressions reflected the same determination that Morrison felt in his own heart, the same unwillingness to abandon fellow servicemen that had driven him to defy orders in the first place. Captain Santos stepped forward as the informal spokesperson for the group. "Commander, we're all in. Just tell us what you need us to do. Morrison felt a surge of emotion as he realized that he was not going to face this impossible mission alone. These brave men and women were willing to risk everything for people they had never met, simply because those people were fellow Americans who needed help. It was the kind of courage and selflessness that made Morrison proud to serve in the United States military. All right, here's the plan. Morrison began as he spread the tactical map across a nearby table. Captain Santos will pilot the primary evacuation aircraft, configured for maximum passenger capacity. I'll fly escort in whatever helicopter Rodriguez can get airborne, providing covering fire during the evacuation. We'll approach the valley from the northeast to avoid the heaviest enemy concentrations, then make a direct assault on the landing zone. Morrison pointed to various locations on the map as he continued his briefing. The key to this mission is speed and surprise. We'll have perhaps 10 minutes on the ground before enemy forces can concentrate their fire on the landing zone. We need to load every available SEAL on Santos's aircraft and get them out of there before the situation becomes completely untenable. Rodriguez raised his hand with a question about aircraft maintenance. Sir, what aircraft will you be flying? Our bird is definitely not capable of combat operations. Morrison had been wondering the same thing when Colonel Patterson cleared his throat and spoke quietly. Morrison, there's an old Huey in the maintenance hangar that's scheduled for retirement next week. It's not the newest aircraft in our inventory, but it's airworthy and equipped with door guns. Officially, I have no knowledge of your plans to use that helicopter. Morrison understood that his commanding officer was providing unofficial support for the mission while maintaining plausible deniability about his involvement. It was the best Patterson could do given the political constraints he was operating under, and Morrison was grateful for even that limited assistance. As the volunteers prepared their aircraft and equipment for the mission, Morrison took a few minutes to call his wife Lisa on the satellite phone. The conversation was brief and deliberately vague, but Morrison wanted to hear her voice one more time before embarking on what might be his final mission. "Jake, you sound different," Lisa said during their conversation. "Is everything okay over there?" Morrison struggled to find the right words to convey his feelings without revealing classified information about the mission. "Lisa, I just want you to know how much I love you and Emma. You two are the most important things in my life, and everything I do is for you." Lisa was quiet for a long moment before responding. "Jake, you're scaring me. What's going on? Are you in danger?" "I'm fine, sweetheart. I just wanted to hear your voice and tell you that I love you. Give Emma a hug for me, and tell her that Daddy is thinking about her." As Morrison ended the call, he felt the weight of his decision pressing down on him even more heavily. He was risking not just his own life, but his future with his family. If this mission went wrong, Emma would grow up without a father, and Lisa would become a widow. The thought of leaving them alone was almost unbearable, but the thought of abandoning 351 fellow servicemen was equally unthinkable. As the final preparations for the mission were completed, Morrison gathered his volunteers around the old Huey helicopter that would serve as his escort aircraft. The helicopter was nearly 40 years old and showed the wear of decades of military service, but Rodriguez had somehow managed to coax it into airworthy condition. "This is it," Morrison announced to the assembled group. "In 30 minutes, we launched the final rescue mission to extract the remaining SEALs from the valley. From this point forward, we're on our own. No official support, no backup, and no second chances. If anyone has second thoughts, now is the time to speak up." The silence that followed Morrison's announcement was profound. These brave men and women had made their choice and were prepared to see it through to whatever end awaited them. Morrison felt honored to serve alongside such dedicated professionals, and he knew that regardless of the mission's outcome, they would give everything they had to save their fellow servicemen. As Morrison climbed into the pilot's seat of the old Huey, he offered a silent prayer for the success of their mission and the safe return of everyone involved. In a few minutes, they would be airborne and committed to a course of action that would either result in the greatest rescue in military history or add their names to the casualty list of a war that seemed to have no end. The two helicopters lifted off from Bagram Air Base as the first drops of rain began to fall from the ominous storm clouds gathering overhead. Morrison's vintage Huey struggled to maintain formation with Captain Santos's more modern Black Hawk, but Rodriguez had worked miracles in the maintenance hangar, and the old aircraft was performing better than anyone had expected. As they flew toward the valley, Morrison could see the full extent of the approaching storm system. Dark clouds stretched from horizon to horizon, and lightning flashes illuminated the towering peaks ahead of them. The wind was already beginning to increase, creating turbulence that made precise flying difficult and dangerous. Morrison's radio crackled with a transmission from Captain Santos. "Angel Flight, this is heavy lift. Weather conditions are deteriorating rapidly. Visibility is dropping, and wind speeds are approaching operational limits. We need to reach the valley soon or abort the mission." Morrison understood the concern in Santos's voice, but he also knew that aborting the mission would mean certain death for the 351 SEALs trapped in the valley. The storm would make helicopter operations impossible for at least 5 days, far longer than the surrounded men could hold out against overwhelming enemy forces. "Heavy lift, this is Angel Flight. We proceed as planned. Those SEALs are counting on us, and this is their last chance." As the two helicopters approached the valley entrance, Morrison could see that the tactical situation had changed dramatically since his last visit. Enemy forces had moved additional anti-aircraft weapons into position around the gorge, and Morrison counted at least 20 different firing positions that had not been present during his earlier rescue flights. The Taliban commanders had clearly learned from Morrison's previous missions and had prepared a comprehensive defense against helicopter operations. The narrow gorge was now bristling with rocket-propelled grenades, heavy machine guns, and what appeared to be at least 2 surface-to-air missile systems positioned on the high ground. "Heavy lift, be advised that enemy anti-aircraft defenses have been significantly reinforced. I count multiple SAM sites and at least 20 heavy weapons positions. This is going to be extremely dangerous." Santos's response was immediate and determined. "Angel Flight, we've come this far, and those SEALs need us. I'm not turning back now." Morrison felt a surge of pride and gratitude as he listened to Santos's unwavering commitment to the mission. These volunteer pilots were risking everything for people they had never met, simply because those people were fellow Americans who needed help. As Morrison began his approach to the gorge entrance, enemy forces opened fire immediately. The first salvo of RPG rounds exploded around his helicopter, filling the air with deadly shrapnel and smoke. Morrison threw his aircraft into violent evasive maneuvers, while Rodriguez returned fire with a door-mounted machine gun. The vintage Huey responded well to Morrison's control inputs, and its smaller size made it a more difficult target than a larger Black Hawk following behind. Morrison used this advantage to draw enemy fire away from Santos's heavily loaded aircraft, flying an erratic pattern that forced Taliban fighters to divide their attention between multiple targets. Halfway through the gorge, Morrison's helicopter was hit by small arms fire that damaged his hydraulic system and caused his controls to become significantly heavier. The old aircraft began to vibrate ominously, and Morrison had to fight to maintain level flight as they continued through the gauntlet of enemy fire. "Angel Flight, you're trailing smoke," Santos called out over the radio. "Are you still capable of continuing the mission?" Morrison checked his engine instruments and saw that his oil pressure was dropping and his engine temperature was climbing. The helicopter was definitely damaged, but it was still flying and still capable of providing cover fire for the evacuation operation. "Heavy lift, I'm still operational. Continue to the landing zone and begin evacuation procedures. I'll provide cover fire for as long as possible." As the two helicopters cleared the gorge and entered the valley, Morrison was shocked by the scene of destruction that greeted them. The village that had served as the SEAL defensive position was now largely in ruins, with most buildings either destroyed or heavily damaged. Smoke was rising from multiple locations, and Morrison could see that the fighting had intensified dramatically since his last visit. Most concerning was the fact that Morrison could not see any signs of organized American defensive positions. The SEALs had been forced to abandon their perimeter and were apparently making their final stand from whatever cover they could find in the rubble of the destroyed village. Morrison immediately tried to establish radio contact with the trapped forces. Viper 77, this is Angel Flight returning for final evacuation. What is your current status and location? Lieutenant Commander Thompson's response came back immediately, but her voice was strained and Morrison could hear intense gunfire in the background. Angel Flight, we're trapped in the basement of the central mosque. Enemy forces control the rest of the village and are attempting to breach our final defensive position. We have 53 wounded, including 22 critical cases. Morrison processed this information while scanning the village for the mosque Thompson had referenced. He finally located the building in question, a partially destroyed structure in the center of the village that was surrounded by enemy fighters. Taliban forces had established firing positions in the buildings around the mosque and were systematically attempting to break down the SEALs' last refuge. Viper 77, we're going to attempt to land in the courtyard adjacent to your position. Can you move your wounded to that location for evacuation? Angel Flight, the courtyard is under direct fire from multiple enemy positions. We'll try to reach it, but we're going to take significant casualties moving through open ground. Morrison realized that the evacuation was going to be even more dangerous than he had anticipated. The SEALs would have to expose themselves to enemy fire in order to reach the landing zone, and many of the wounded would not survive the movement under fire. Captain Santos had been monitoring the radio traffic and immediately offered a solution. Angel Flight, I'm going to land as close to the mosque as possible and provide covering fire with my door guns. Can you suppress the enemy positions on the north side of the village? Morrison studied the tactical situation and identified several enemy positions that were preventing the SEALs from reaching the landing zone. The old Huey's door guns would not be sufficient to neutralize all of these positions, but Morrison might be able to create enough confusion to allow the evacuation to proceed. Heavy lift. I'll make a gun run on the northern positions and try to draw their attention away from your landing zone. Begin your approach when you see me start firing. Morrison banked his helicopter into a steep dive toward the enemy positions on the north side of the village. Rodriguez opened fire with both door guns as they descended, sending streams of tracer rounds into the Taliban fighting positions. Enemy fighters scattered for cover as Morrison's helicopter swept low over their positions, but return fire was immediate and intense. Morrison's aircraft was hit multiple times during the gun run, and he could feel the helicopter becoming less responsive to his control inputs. Smoke began filling the cockpit as electrical systems failed, but Morrison managed to complete his attack run and pull up for another pass. While Morrison was engaging the northern enemy positions, Captain Santos brought her Black Hawk in for a landing in the